It seems like a normal act when a white sergeant arrests a black woman for jogging. What did the girl do? Why was she arrested? Will she let it go or stand up for herself? Watch now on H2 Black Thread. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos, because the truth deserves to be told. Let's begin. The sun hung high in the sky over Brookhaven, Ohio, casting sharp rays onto the pristine sidewalks and neatly trimmed hedges of one of the town's most affluent neighborhoods. It was the kind of place where residents paid premium prices for peace of mind, their security ensured by private surveillance systems, well-kept streets, and the occasional police patrol. Crime was rare here. Suspicion, however, was not. Sergeant Patrick Calloway cruised slowly down the main boulevard, one hand lazily resting on the steering wheel, the other idly drumming against the center console. 20 years on the force had taught him that even in a safe neighborhood, trouble had a way of sneaking in where it didn't belong. Or at least, that was how he saw it. Calloway considered himself a man of strong instincts, the kind of officer who could spot a problem before it started. It was a skill, a finely tuned sixth sense that had carried him through his career. He didn't need hard evidence, he just knew when something felt off. And right now, as his patrol car rolled smoothly down Hampton Drive, something, or rather, someone, made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Up ahead, a black woman in her mid-40s jogged along the sidewalk, her stride rhythmic, strong, and confident. She moved with ease, her focus directed forward, lost in whatever music played through the earbuds nestled in her ears. Her skin glistened under the heat of the midday sun, beads of sweat dotting her forehead, but she didn't look fatigued, only determined. She belonged here, at least she looked like she did, and yet something about her unsettled Calloway. She was too composed, too confident, too unbothered by his presence. Most people, even the ones who had nothing to hide, acknowledged a police cruiser when it passed by. A quick glance, a nod, sometimes a friendly wave. But she didn't. She just kept running. Calloway narrowed his eyes, following her movements as she approached a house on the right. A two-story, cream-colored colonial with a wide driveway and a silver Tesla parked neatly in front. He watched closely as she passed the car. Did she glance at it? Did she slow down for just a second too long? The logical part of his brain told him no, she had done nothing out of the ordinary. But the part of him that prided itself on detecting threats before they happened whispered something else. Something about her presence here just didn't sit right. Maybe it was the expensive running gear, the sleek black athletic leggings, the moisture-wicking tank top, the high-end running shoes that cost more than half his paycheck. Maybe it was the way she didn't hesitate or fumble when she saw his patrol car rolling up beside her. Maybe it was simply the fact that she was here at all. His suspicion took root. Where did she come from? He muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He ran through the possibilities. Did she just leave that house? If so, was she a resident? Was she casing properties? Scouting out which driveways had high-end cars, which homes looked empty during the day? Or was it nothing at all? That last thought made his jaw clench. He hated second-guessing himself. His instincts had never failed him before. The woman jogged on, her pace steady, her breathing even. She reached an intersection, about to turn left onto another quiet residential street. Calloway had a decision to make. He could let her go, dismiss his unease as nothing more than paranoia. But what if he was right? What if he let her slip past and found out later that a house had been burglarized or a car stolen? He couldn't afford to take that risk. With a flick of his wrist, he activated his turn signal, easing his patrol car to the curb just ahead of her. He had questions, and she was going to answer them. The air between them shifted the moment Calloway stepped out of his car. The crunch of his boots against the pavement broke the gentle stillness of the neighborhood. The woman noticed him now. Her steps slowed as she tugged out one of her earbuds, her brow slightly furrowed in curiosity, but not fear. That, more than anything, irked him. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice smooth, level. Her breathing was heavy from her run, but controlled. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead and let her hand rest on her hip, waiting. Calloway's gaze flickered over her before settling on her eyes. Dark brown, sharp, unreadable. He squared his shoulders, instinctively adjusting his stance, feet shoulder-width apart, one hand resting near his belt. Not gripping anything, not yet, but making sure she noticed. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his voice even, steady. The woman blinked, taken aback for only a fraction of a second before she responded. "Home," she said simply. "Just out for a run." Calloway tilted his head slightly. Non-committal. Vague. "Where's home?" A pause. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. "A couple blocks down," she replied, nodding in the direction she had come from. "Got ID on you, there." The moment everything shifted, her posture tensed, not dramatically but enough for him to notice. Her expression didn't harden, but the casual ease she had before was gone. "For what?" Calloway lifted his chin slightly. He didn't like being questioned. "Just need to make sure everything checks out," he said. A sharp exhale, hands on her hips. "You stopped a woman jogging in broad daylight," she said, tone edged with something colder now, "because you think I'm a threat." Calloway didn't answer. Didn't need to. Her lips pressed together, the faintest hint of a humorless smile curling at the corner. Then she reached into her pocket, not for an ID but for her phone. "You know what?" she said. "Let's just call someone who actually enforces the law correctly." Calloway's jaw tightened. This was escalating. She shouldn't have done that. Before she could press the screen, he took a step forward, not aggressively, not violently, but deliberately. "Ma'am," he said, his voice lower now, more commanding, "I'm not going to ask again. Show me some identification." Her fingers tightened around her phone. Calloway noticed. And in that moment, he made a decision, one that would alter the course of his career forever. The tension in the air was nearly tangible, an invisible force pressing between Sergeant Patrick Calloway and the woman standing before him. Everything about this situation should have been routine. A stop, a few questions, a quick check to ensure there was nothing suspicious. Instead, it had become something else entirely. Something heavier, something charged. Calloway had dealt with difficult civilians before, people who questioned his authority, who pushed back against his requests, who made his job more difficult than it needed to be. But they always cracked. They always buckled under the weight of his badge, his presence, his authority. Brianna Hayes did not. She stood her ground, unmoved, her deep brown eyes locked on him with something unreadable, something that felt dangerously close to defiance. She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't causing a scene. She was simply refusing to submit. And that, more than anything, got under Calloway's skin. The street was quiet except for the occasional whisper of a breeze rustling through the neatly trimmed hedges. A few cars passed in the distance, their engines a soft hum against the otherwise still atmosphere of the affluent neighborhood. Brianna had one earbud still in, as if part of her still wasn't convinced that this encounter deserved her full attention. That small act irritated him. She wasn't acting guilty. She wasn't afraid of him. She should have been. Most people were. He let his weight shift slightly, adjusting his stance, ensuring his badge and gun were fully visible on his hip. "Where are you coming from?" His voice was controlled, steady, the same tone he'd used 1,000 times before in similar situations. Brianna blinked once, then exhaled through her nose. "Home." "Where's home?" A brief pause. A second too long, she hesitated, just barely. A couple blocks down. Calloway narrowed his eyes slightly. Vague, too vague. Which street? Her head tilted slightly, the faintest crease appearing between her brows. Excuse me. Calloway's jaw tightened. She had heard him. She was stalling. I asked which street your home is on. Her lips pressed together for a fraction of a second before she answered. Maplewood Drive. A lie. Maybe. But he didn't like that he even had to wonder. He exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against his belt. Got ID on you. A beat of silence. There it was. The shift. The way her body, previously loose and relaxed, tensed ever so slightly. She recognized the request for what it was. It wasn't a request at all. It was a test, a challenge, a demand for compliance, and she wasn't going to give in so easily. For what? Her voice was still calm, but there was an edge now, a quiet, razor-sharp defiance woven beneath the words. Calloway lifted his chin slightly, tilting his head in that subtle way he did when he wanted to make someone uncomfortable. Just need to make sure everything checks out. Brianna inhaled through her nose, her fingers resting lightly on her hips. You stopped a woman jogging in broad daylight because you think I'm a threat. Calloway didn't answer. He didn't have to. She already knew the answer. A short, humorless huff of laughter escaped her lips, her head shaking just slightly. Yeah, that's what I thought. She reached into her pocket, slow, deliberate. Calloway tensed. A flicker of warning fired through his instincts. Then he saw what she was reaching for, not an ID, a phone. She lifted it, her thumb moving toward the screen. You know what? She muttered. Let's just call someone who actually enforces the law correctly. That was it, the final straw. Calloway didn't think, he reacted. His instincts screamed at him, not words, not logic, just raw, gut-level impulse. She was challenging him, not just with her words but with her actions. Right here, right now, in front of anyone who might be watching. He took a sharp step forward. Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. She barely had time to glance up before he grabbed her wrist. Brianna sucked in a sharp breath, body instinctively tensing as his fingers clamped down. What the hell? His grip was firm, practiced. A pivot. A yank. Her arm wrenched behind her back. Her muscles locked tight, but he had the upper hand now. She was no longer in control, and then the snap of metal. Cuffs flashing in the sunlight. Click. Click. Locked. Brianna let out a short, sharp exhale, her jaw tightening as she twisted slightly in his grip. You've got to be kidding me. Calloway's voice was automatic now, detached, like a script he had repeated 100 times before. You're under arrest for obstruction. Brianna went completely still. The only sound was her steady breathing. The street was silent. Then the sound of a phone camera clicking on, a rustle of movement, the faint murmur of a voice, then another. And another. Calloway's pulse hammered in his ears, his grip on the cuffs tightened, but the damage was already done. Somewhere behind him, a voice rang out sharp, cutting through the still air. Hey, she wasn't doing anything. Another voice closer. I'm recording this. Brianna exhaled through her nose, slow and steady. Then, without looking back at him, she muttered, just loud enough for him to hear, You just made the biggest mistake of your career. Calloway's fingers twitched. His heart pounded. For the first time since this interaction started, doubt flickered in his chest. But it was too late now. He had already crossed the line, and there was no undoing it. The sharp click of the handcuffs locking into place sliced through the still afternoon air like a gunshot. For a moment, everything was silent. Even Brianna Hayes had stilled, her chest rising and falling in controlled, measured breaths. But that silence was short-lived. It started as a murmur. A faint whisper of movement, the shuffling of feet on pavement. Then, the unmistakable sound of a phone camera clicking on. And then another. And another. Across the street, A man in his late 50s lowered the newspaper he had been reading on his front porch, his brow creasing in confusion. Further down, a young woman watering her plants froze, her grip tightening around the hose as water spilled over onto the sidewalk, forgotten. On the opposite sidewalk, a man paused mid-jog, yanking out his own earbuds as he took in the scene. And then, just like that, the onlookers became witnesses. Phones were raised, screens glowed, and somewhere in the distance a voice rang out sharp and cutting through the hot, stagnant air like a blade. "Yo, what the hell? She wasn't even doing anything." Another voice, female this time, closer. "I'm recording this." Brianna exhaled slowly, her gaze locked on some distant point beyond Calloway's shoulder. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't resisting. She didn't need to, because she knew. Calloway was the one in trouble now. Sergeant Patrick Calloway's jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. His grip on Brianna's wrist tightened as if that could somehow anchor him, keep him in control of the situation. The situation he had created. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to just cooperate, hand over her ID, answer his questions, recognize his authority. Instead, she had stood her ground. She had challenged him. And now the whole damn street was watching. A bead of sweat slid down the side of his temple, and suddenly the sun felt oppressively hot. Still, he doubled down, his voice hardening to mask the uncertainty creeping in. "You refuse to comply," he said, more for the growing audience than for Brianna herself. Brianna finally turned her head toward him, her expression unreadable. "Comply with what?" she asked, her voice even, but the weight of her words hit like a hammer. Calloway's mouth opened, but nothing came out. And that's when he heard it, the low, steady rumble of an approaching engine. A black SUV rolled smoothly to a stop at the curb. No markings, dark tinted windows, a car that didn't belong to just anyone. Calloway felt his stomach drop. He knew that kind of car. Everyone on the force did. And as the door opened, his worst fear stepped out. Captain Marcus Briggs, his commanding officer, and he looked furious. Briggs was a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his mid-50s, his presence imposing without effort. His uniform was crisp, his expression stone-cold, but his eyes were burning. The bystanders took a step back, sensing the shift in power. Even the ones holding their phones lowered them slightly, suddenly more interested in watching this unfold in real time. Briggs didn't look at them. His eyes were locked on Calloway, and Calloway, for the first time since he stepped out of his patrol car, felt something dangerously close to fear. "Uncuff her." Briggs' voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The weight of it alone was enough to command obedience. Calloway hesitated. Confused, defiant. "Sir," Briggs stepped forward. "I said uncuff her. Now." His voice was sharp as a whip crack. Calloway's throat went dry. He had no choice. His fingers fumbled slightly as he reached for the cuffs, the adrenaline in his veins suddenly feeling like poison. With a sharp metallic click, the restraints popped open. Brianna rubbed her wrists slowly, deliberately. She wasn't smug. She wasn't gloating. She didn't have to. She had already won. Briggs exhaled through his nose, his jaw tight. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice quieter now but no less furious. Calloway swallowed hard. "Sir," she refused to. Briggs held up a hand. A single hand, and Calloway shut up. Briggs turned to Brianna. "Are you hurt?" Brianna flexed her wrists once before shaking her head. "I'm fine." Briggs nodded once, but his face remained hard. Then he turned back to Calloway. "You have any idea who you just put in handcuffs?" Calloway stiffened. His mouth opened, closed. He had assumed Brianna was just another civilian. Another person with an attitude. Another problem to neutralize. But suddenly, The reality of the moment felt a lot bigger than it had 5 minutes ago. Calloway glanced at Brianna again. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was watching Briggs. And there was something in her expression, something sharp, something knowing that made Calloway's chest go tight. Briggs exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. Then he spoke. "You just arrested your boss." Silence. A heavy, crushing silence. The blood drained from Calloway's face. His pulse thundered in his ears. Brianna tilted her head slightly, watching him process the weight of his mistake. Calloway's lips parted, but no words came out. Briggs straightened his posture. "Sergeant Calloway, you're relieved of duty until further notice." The words hit like a brick wall. "Hand over your badge and your gun." The onlookers, once whispering, now watched in stunned silence. One woman muttered, "Holy shit." A man near the curb shook his head, recording the entire thing. Calloway didn't move, didn't breathe, but his hands did. Slowly, mechanically, they reached for his badge. He unpinned it, the metal suddenly feeling too heavy. Briggs held out his hand. Calloway set the badge in his palm. Then, with a clenched jaw, he unholstered his gun, and as he placed it in Briggs' waiting grasp, he knew. It was over. Brianna Hayes flexed her wrists, rolling them slowly as the soreness from the tight handcuffs lingered in her muscles. The dull ache wasn't what held her attention, though. It was the man standing before her. Sergeant Patrick Calloway, who had spent 20 years on the force believing he could size up anyone in a heartbeat, stood frozen like a statue. His face was unreadable, but his eyes told the story of a man who had just realized he had made a mistake he could never undo. The world was no longer moving on his terms. The once quiet neighborhood had transformed into a stage with Calloway at its center. Around him, the audience had gathered, silent, watchful, recording. The murmur of the crowd was growing. It wasn't just a handful of people anymore. Neighbors who had been inside their homes peeked through curtains. A jogger who had slowed earlier now stood at the curb, phone in hand. A mother walking with her young son had stopped entirely, whispering something into his ear. The sun was high, but the air felt heavy, thick. And then Briggs spoke. His words, sharp and unwavering, cut through the tense silence like a blade. "Do you even know who you just arrested?" It wasn't a question. It was a reckoning. Calloway swallowed hard. The words rang in his ears, but his pride wouldn't let him accept what was happening. He shifted his weight, attempting to reclaim some semblance of control. "She refused to show ID. I was following protocol." Brianna stepped forward. Not rushed, not frantic. Every movement was measured, precise, deliberate. And when she spoke, her voice was calm but unyielding, a voice that had commanded rooms far larger than this one. "My name is Chief Brianna Hayes." She let the words sink in. She let him feel them. Then she added the final blow, "And you just arrested your boss." The moment stretched, expanding into something tangible and suffocating. The words slammed into Calloway like a truck. His breath caught in his throat. He blinked. Once. Twice. Trying to process what had just happened, but there was no processing this. His mind scrambled for an out, some way to make sense of what he had just done, some excuse that would make it all disappear. But there was none. And Brianna knew it. And the crowd knew it. And most importantly, Briggs knew it. The people watching weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses. They had seen everything. The way he had stopped her for no reason. The way he had demanded ID she wasn't required to carry. The way he had put his hands on her, twisted her arms, cuffed her in broad daylight as if she were a criminal. And now they were watching him crumble. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the distant sound of traffic. He had spent 2 decades on the force believing he could never be wrong, that his instincts were always justified, that if he stopped someone, it was because they had done something to deserve it. But now he was standing face to face with the undeniable truth. The truth that he had arrested the highest-ranking officer in the department, that he had humiliated his own boss, that there was no walking away from this. Briggs' stance didn't change, but his disappointment was deafening. "You're suspended." The words hit like a gunshot. Calloway flinched before he could stop himself. It wasn't just a reprimand. It was a public execution. The weight of those two words settled into his chest, pressing down until he thought his ribs might crack. "Hand over your badge and gun." "Now." Calloway's mouth opened. He wanted to fight it, wanted to argue, wanted to say anything that might turn this around. But there was nothing, because he had already lost. Briggs extended his hand, waiting, not moving, not offering an ounce of sympathy. And Calloway, for the first time in his life, had no choice but to obey. He moved slowly, every motion feeling disconnected, robotic. He reached for his badge, the symbol of everything he had been. It felt heavier now, so much heavier than before, like it had already been stripped of its meaning. With shaking fingers, he unclipped it and placed it in Briggs' open palm. And then, his gun. The metal felt ice cold against his skin. It had once been an extension of his authority. Now it was a relic of the power he no longer had. He set it in Briggs' hand, and the moment it left his grip, something inside him cracked. It was over. Everything was over. Brianna watched it happen. She saw the way Calloway's hands trembled, the way his shoulders hunched under the invisible weight of what he had done. But she wasn't angry anymore. She was disappointed, and somehow that was worse. Briggs turned to her. "Chief, if you want to file a formal complaint, we can handle it immediately." Brianna inhaled deeply, then let it out in a slow breath. Her voice was calm, controlled, but heavy with meaning. "No need." Calloway's head snapped up. For the first time since this ordeal began, he looked at her, not as a suspect, but as a person. "He'll live with this mistake for the rest of his life." The words struck deeper than she probably intended. Because she was right. He would never escape this. His face, his failure, his downfall had been recorded. It would be on social media within the hour. It would be on the news by the end of the day. His career was not just over. His entire reputation was gone, and he knew it. He felt it in his bones. Brianna and Briggs walked away. And Calloway stood alone. The people who had been watching turned away, whispering among themselves. The ones still recording lowered their phones, shaking their heads. He had gone from being an enforcer of the law to being just another disgraced officer. Just another headline. Just another example of exactly what was wrong with the system. His patrol car sat parked behind him, but he didn't move. Because for the first time in his career, Calloway had to ask himself a question he had never considered before. Who was he without his badge? And the terrifying truth was, he didn't know. Sergeant Patrick Calloway sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, hands resting on his thighs, fingers curled slightly as if they still remembered the weight of his badge. But his badge was gone. His gun was gone. And with them, so was everything he thought he knew about himself. The air inside the car felt stale, suffocating, pressing in on him as though the very space he occupied was rejecting him. Outside, the sun blazed high, bathing the neighborhood in golden light, but Calloway felt cold. His windshield framed the scene before him like a photograph he wished he could look away from. But he couldn't, because standing just a few feet away, Brianna Hayes was still there. She wasn't watching him. She wasn't even acknowledging his presence anymore. She stood tall, surrounded by a few people, neighbors, bystanders, people who had seen the entire thing unfold. Some of them spoke with her, their heads nodding, their faces carrying an unspoken respect. Not as a police officer, not because she wore a uniform, but because of who she was. And Calloway, no one looked at him. No one cared that he was still sitting there, his hands limp in his lap, his world unraveling by the second. He had been erased. The authority he had once commanded, the respect he had once expected, the power he had always assumed was his. It was all gone. And the worst part, He wasn't sure if he had ever deserved it in the first place. For years, Calloway had told himself a story where he was the good guy, where he was keeping the peace, where he was protecting the people who needed protecting. He had believed in law and order, but more than that, he had believed that he alone had the right to define it. He had believed that his instincts were infallible, that his decisions were beyond question, that if he stopped someone, it was because they needed to be stopped. He had believed he knew justice, but today that belief had destroyed him. Today that belief had put an innocent woman in handcuffs. Today that belief had cost him his career, his dignity, and the respect of an entire community. His fingers twitched slightly, restless, searching for something to ground him. But there was nothing left to hold on to. He inhaled shakily, the sound too loud in the silence of the car. For the first time in 20 years, Patrick Calloway was unsure of himself, and that terrified him more than anything. His mind drifted, pulling him backward into memories he hadn't thought about in years. The first time he ever put someone in cuffs. He had been 24, fresh out of the academy, full of pride and purpose. His training officer had told him, "You'll know who to stop, you'll know who to watch." And he had believed it. He had let his instincts guide him. He had trusted his gut, just like today. But now, looking back, a thought surfaced, one that chilled him to the bone. How many times had he done this before? How many times had he made an assumption that had cost someone their dignity? How many times had he put someone in handcuffs who had done nothing wrong, except exist in a place he didn't think they belonged? And how many times had he walked away, convinced that he was in the right? His stomach churned. For years he had dismissed complaints, ignored accusations of racial profiling, waved off concerns from community leaders. If you don't resist, you don't get arrested. How many times had he said that? But now the truth was staring him in the face. Brianna Hayes hadn't resisted, she hadn't been a threat, she hadn't done anything wrong, and yet he had still put her in cuffs. Why? Because she questioned him. Because she didn't immediately submit, because she wasn't afraid of him. A bitter taste filled his mouth. The answer was so simple, so damning, so painfully clear. It had never been about law and order. It had never been about justice. It had been about control. And today, for the first time, he had lost. Outside, Brianna was saying something to Briggs. She looked calm, collected, as though this entire ordeal hadn't shaken her at all. And maybe it hadn't. Maybe she had been through this before. Maybe she had known from the very start that she would come out of this with her dignity intact, while Calloway would leave in disgrace. The thought sent a sickening wave of nausea rolling through his stomach. Because if this had happened to her, a police chief, a woman with power, with status, then how many times had it happened to others who had no voice? How many times had people been arrested, harassed, humiliated, with no one to fight for them? The thought struck him harder than anything else. How many others have gone through this but had no title to protect them? The question burned into him, seared itself into his mind like a brand. It was one he would never be able to shake, because the truth was he already knew the answer. He had just never been willing to face it. Until now. The world outside the windshield blurred. Calloway could still hear Briggs speaking, the voices of the bystanders, the low hum of the city beyond this street. But it all felt far away. The only thing that felt real was the weight of the moment. The weight of his choices. The weight of everything he had done that had led to this day. He had spent 20 years believing he was one of the good ones. But today he had been the villain. Today he had been the face of everything wrong with the system he had sworn to uphold. And now he had to live with that. His breath came uneven. His chest felt tight. And for the first time in his life, Patrick Calloway didn't know what came next. Outside, the sun still shined. The world kept moving. People walked away, their conversations fading, their phones slipping back into their pockets. But the damage was done. The cameras had caught everything. His career was over. His reputation was gone. And still, the system remained unchanged. This wasn't just about one bad cop making a mistake. This was about a system that allowed mistakes like this to keep happening. A system that had protected him for years. A system that had allowed him to believe he was untouchable. A system that had let him get away with it until today. The real question was, when will it stop? And more importantly, who will stand up to change it?